Hi, sleepless brothers and sisters. Here comes your favorite doctor, the best one to gently put you to sleep. So get comfortable, relax, turn off the lights in your room, and slow down that fan just enough to feel the silence. Let the world fade away as you enjoy the soft whispers of history. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for your daily dose of sleeping history. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. We always love seeing our global community come together. 10 minutes to 4, sir. It is an oil-skinned and dripping seaman, and the officer of the watch, or his so-called snotty, as the case may be, wakes sufficiently to ask, "What's it like?" "2 hoops, sir," answers the seaman, and makes his way out. The sleepy man who has been wakened wedges himself more securely into his 6'2", which is all his private room on the ship, and collects his thoughts amid the general hubbub of engines, screw, and the roll of articles which have worked loose, to consider how he will best prevent being hurled out of his bunk in climbing down, and just where he left his oilskins and sea boots. If, as is possible, he sleeps in the nursery, his task may not be so simple as it may seem, for this cabin, which proclaims on one of the beams that it is designed to accommodate 4 seamen, will house 6 scientists or pseudoscientists, in addition to a pianola. Since these scientists are the youngest in the expedition, their cabin is named the nursery. Incidentally, it forms also the gangway from the wardroom to the engine room, from which it is divided only by a wooden door, which has a bad habit of swinging open and shutting with the roll of the ship and the weight of the oilskins hung upon it, and as it does so, wave upon wave, the clatter of the engines advances and recedes. If, however, it is the officer of the watch, he will be in a smaller cabin farther aft, which he shares with one other man only, and his troubles are simplified, owing to the fact that the seams in the deck above have traveled many voyages and have been strained in addition by the boat davits and deck houses built on the poop. A good deal of water from this part of the deck, which is always awash in bad weather, finds its way below, that is into the upper bunks of our cabin. In order that only a minimum of this may find its way into our blankets, a series of chutes, invented and carefully tended by the occupants of these bunks, are arranged to catch this water as it falls and carry it over our heads onto the deck of the cabin. Thus it is that when this sleepy officer or scientist clambers down onto the deck, he will, if he is lucky, find the water there, instead of leaving it in his bunk. He searches round for his sea boots, gets into his oilskins, curses if the strings of his sou'wester break as he tries to tie them extra firmly round his neck, and pushes along to the open door into the wardroom. It is still quite dark, for the sun does not rise for another hour and a half, but the diminished light from the swinging oil lamp which hangs there shows him a desolate early morning scene which he comes to hate, especially if he is inclined to be sick. As likely as not, more than one sea has partially found its way down during the night, and a small stream runs over the floor each time the ship rolls. The white oilcloth has slipped off the table, and various oddments, dirty cocoa cups, ashtrays, and other litter from the night are rolling about too. The tin cups and plates and crockery in the pantry forward of the wardroom come together with a sickening crash. Watching his opportunity, he slides down across the wet linoleum to the starboard side, whence the gangway runs up to the chart house and so out onto the deck. Having glanced at the barograph slung up in the chart room and using all his strength to force the door out enough to squeeze through, he scrambles out into blackness. The wind is howling through the rigging. The decks are awash. It is hard to say whether it is raining, for the spray cut off by the wind makes rain a somewhat insignificant event. As he makes his way up onto the bridge, Not a very lofty climb. He looks to see what sail is set, and judges so far as he can the force of the wind. Campbell, for he is the officer of the morning watch, 4 a.m., 8 a.m., has a talk with the officer he is relieving, Bowers. He is given the course, the last hour's reading on the cherub patent log trailing out over the stern, and the experiences of the middle watch of the wind, whether rising or falling or squalling, and its effect on the sails in the ship. If you keep her on her present course, she's all right, but if you try and bring her up any more, she begins to shake. And by the way, Penelope wants to be called at 4:30. Bowers Snotty, who is Oates, probably makes some ribald remarks, such as no midshipman should to a full lieutenant, and they both disappear below. Campbell's Snotty myself appears about 5 minutes afterwards, trying to look as though some important duty, and not bed, had kept him from making an earlier appearance. Meanwhile, the leading hand musters the watch on deck and reports them all present. "How about that cocoa?" says Campbell. Cocoa is a useful thing in the morning watch, and Gran, who used to be Campbell's Snotty, and whose English was not then perfect, said he was glad of a change because he did not like being turned into a drumstick. He meant a domestic. So cocoa is the word, and the Snotty starts on an adventurous voyage over the deck to the galley which is forward. If he is unlucky, he gets a sea over him on the way. Here he finds the hands of the watch, smoking and keeping warm, and he forages round for some hot water, which he gets safely back to the pantry down in the wardroom. Here he mixes the cocoa and collects sufficient clean mugs, if he can find them, spoons, sugar, and biscuits to go round. These he carefully chalks off while he goes and calls Wilson and gives him his share, for Wilson gets up at 4:30 every morning to sketch the sunrise, work at his scientific paintings, and watch the seabirds flying round the ship, then back to the bridge, and woe betide him if he falls on the way, for then it all has to be done over again. Pennell, who sleeps under the chart table on the bridge, is also fed and inquires anxiously whether there are any stars showing. If there are, he is up immediately to get an observation, and then retires below to work it out and to tabulate the endless masses of figures which go to make up the results of his magnetic observations. Dip, horizontal force, and total force of the magnetic needle. A squall strikes the ship. 2 blasts of the whistle fetches the watch out, and stand-by topsail halyards, in inner jib, sends one hand to one halyard, the midshipman of the watch to the other, and the rest on to forecastle and to the jib downhaul. Down comes the jib, and the man standing by the fore topsail halyard, which is on the weather side of the galley, is drenched by the crests of 2 big seas which come over the rail. But he has little time to worry about things like this, for the wind is increasing and "Let go topsail halyards" comes through the megaphone from the bridge, and he wants all his wits to let go the halyard from the belaying pins and jump clear of the rope tearing through the block as the topsail yard comes sliding down the mast. Clew up is the next order, and then all hands furl fore and main upper topsails, and up we go out onto the yard. Luckily, the dawn is just turning the sea gray, and the ratlines begin to show up in relief. It is far harder for the first and middle watches, who have to go aloft in complete darkness. Once on the yard, you are flattened against it by the wind. The order to take in sail always fetches Pennell out of his chart house to come and take a hand. The 2 sodden sails safely furled. Luckily, they are small ones. The men reach the deck to find that the wind has shifted a little farther aft, and they are to brace round. This finished, it is broad daylight, and the men set to work to coil up preparatory to washing decks. Not that this would seem very necessary. Certainly there is no hose wanted this morning, and a general kind of tidying up and coiling down ropes is more what is done. The two stewards, Hooper, who is to land with the main party, and Neil, who will remain with the ship's party, turn out at 6 and rouse the afterguard for the pumps, a daily evolution, and soon an unholy din may be heard coming up from the wardroom. Rouse and shine, show a leg, a relic of the old days when seamen took their wives to sea. Come on, Mr. Nelson, it's 7 o'clock, all hands on the pumps. From first to last, these pumps were a source of much exercise and hearty curses. A wooden ship always leaks a little, but the amount of water taken in by the Terra Nova, even in calm weather, was extraordinary, and could not be traced until the ship was dry docked in Littleton, New Zealand, and the forepart was flooded. In the meantime, the ship had to be kept as dry as possible, a process which was not facilitated by 40 gallons of oil which got loose during the rough weather after leaving South Trinidad and found its way into the bilges. As we found later, some never-to-be sufficiently cursed stevedore had left one of the bottom boards only half-fitted into its neighbors. In consequence, the coal dust and small pieces of coal, which was stowed in this hold, found their way into the bilges. 40 gallons of oil completed the havoc, and the pumps would gradually get more and more blocked until it was necessary to send for Davies, the carpenter, to take parts of them to pieces and clear out the oily coal balls which had stopped them. This pumping would sometimes take till nearly 8, and then would always have to be repeated again in the evening, and sometimes every watch had to take a turn. At any rate, it was good for our muscles. The pumps were placed amidships, just abaft the main mast, and ran down a shaft adjoining the after hatch, which led into the holds which were generally used for coal and patent fuel. The spout of the pump opened about a foot above the deck, and the plungers were worked by means of 2 horizontal handles, much as a bucket is wound up on the drum of a cottage well. Unfortunately, this part of the main deck, which is just forward of the break of the poop, is more subject to seas breaking inboard than any other part of the ship, so when the ship was laboring, the task of those on the pump was not an enviable one. During the big gale going south, the water was up to the men's waists as they tried to turn the handles, and the pumps themselves were feet under water. From England to Cape Town, these small handles were a great inconvenience. There was very much pumping to be done, and there were plenty of men to do it, but the handles were not long enough to allow more than 4 men to each handle. Also, they gave no secure purchase when the ship was rolling heavily, and when a big roll came, there was nothing to do but practically stop pumping and hold on, or you found yourself in the scuppers. At Cape Town, a great improvement was made by extending the crank handles right across the decks, the outside end turning in a socket under the rail. 14 men could then get a good purchase on the handles, and pumping became a more pleasant exercise and less of a nuisance. Periodically, the well was sounded by an iron rod being lowered on the end of a rope, by which the part that came up wet showed the depth of water left in the bilge. When this had been reduced to about a foot in the well, the ship was practically dry, and the afterguard free to bathe and go to breakfast. Meanwhile, the hands of the watch had been employed on ropes and sails, as the wind made necessary, and, when running under steam as well as sail, hoisting ashes up the 2 chutes from the ash pits of the furnaces to the deck, whence they went into the ditch. It is 8 bells, 8 o'clock, and the 2 stewards are hurrying along the decks, hoping to get the breakfast safely from galley to wardroom. A few naked officers are pouring seawater over their heads on deck, for we are under sail alone, and there is no steam to work the hose. The watchkeepers and their snotties of the night before are tumbling out of their bunks, and a great noise of conversation is coming from the wardroom, among which some such remarks as, give the jam a wind, Marie. After you with the coffee, push along the butter, are frequent. There are few cobwebs that have not been blown away by breakfast time. Rennick is busy breakfasting preparatory to relieving Campbell on the bridge. Meanwhile, the hourly and 4-hourly ship's log is being made up. Force of the wind, state of the sea, height of the barometer, and all the details which a log has to carry, including a reading of the distance run as shown by the patent log line. Many is the time I have forgotten to take it just at the hour and have put down what I thought it ought to be, and not what it was. The morning watch is finished. Suddenly there is a yell from somewhere amidships. Steady. A stranger might have thought there was something wrong, but it is a familiar sound, answered by a "Steady it is, sir," from the man at the wheel, and in anything but respectful. 1, 2, 3, steady, from everybody having breakfast. It is Pennell who has caused this uproar, and the origin is as follows. Pennell is the navigator, and the standard compass, owing to its remoteness from iron in this position, is placed on the top of the ice house. The steersman, however, steers by a binnacle compass placed aft in front of his wheel. But these two compasses, for various reasons, do not read alike at a given moment, while the standard is the truer of the two. At intervals, then, Pennell or the officer of the watch orders the steersman to stand by for a steady, and goes up to the standard compass and watches the needle. Suppose the course laid down is S40E. A liner would steer almost true to this course, unless there was a big wind or sea. But not so the old Terra Nova. Even with a good steersman, the needle swings a good many degrees either side of the S40E. But as it steadies momentarily on the exact course, Pennell shouts his "steady." The steersman reads just where the needle is pointing on the compass card before him, say S47E, and knows that this is the course which is to be steered by the binnacle compass. Pennell's yells were so frequent and ear-piercing that he became famous for them, and many times in working on the ropes in rough seas and big winds, we have been cheered by this unmusical noise over our heads. We left Simon's Bay on Friday, September 2nd, to make our easting down from the Cape of Good Hope to New Zealand, that famous passage in the Roaring Forties, which can give so much discomfort or worse to sailing ships on their way. South Africa had been hospitable. The admiral commanding the station, the naval dockyard, and HMS Mutine and HMS Pandora had been more than kind. They had done many repairs and fittings for us, and had sent fatigue parties to do it, thus releasing men for a certain amount of freedom on shore, which was appreciated after some 9 weeks at sea. I can remember my first long bath now. Scott, who was up country when we arrived, joined the ship here, and Wilson traveled ahead of us to Melbourne to carry out some expedition work, chiefly dealing with the Australian members who were to join us in New Zealand. 1 or 2 of us went out to Wynberg, which Oates knew well, having been invalided there in the South African War with a broken leg, the result of a fight against big odds when, his whole party wounded, he refused to surrender. He told me later how he had thought he would bleed to death, and the man who lay next to him was convinced he had a bullet in the middle of his brain. He could feel it wobbling about there. Just now his recollections only went so far as to tell of a badly wounded Boer who lay in the next bed to him when he was convalescent, and how the Boer insisted on getting up to open the door for him every time he left the ward, much to his own discomfort. Otherwise, the recollections which survive of South Africa are an excellent speech made on the expedition by John Xavier Merriman, and the remark of a seaman who came out to dinner concerning one John, the waiter, that he moved about as quick as a piece of sticking plaster. Leaving Simon's Town at daybreak, we did magnetic work all day, sailing out from False Bay with a biggish swell in the evening. We ran southerly in good weather until Sunday morning, when the swell was logged at 8 and the glass was falling fast. By the middle watch, it was blowing a full gale, and for some 30 hours we ran under reefed foresail, lower topsails, and occasionally reefed upper topsails, and many of us were sick. Then after 2 days of comparative calm, we had a most extraordinary gale from the east, a thing almost unheard of in these latitudes, 38 degrees to 39 degrees. All that we could do was to put the engines at dead slow and sail northerly as close to the wind as possible. Friday night, September 9th, it blew force 10 in the night, and the morning watch was very lively with the lee rail under water. Directly after breakfast on Saturday, September 10th, we wore ship, and directly afterwards the gale broke and it was raining, with little wind, during the day. The morning watch had a merry time on Tuesday, September 13th, when a fresh gale struck them while they were squaring yards. So unexpected was it that the main yards were squared and the fore were still round. But it did not last long and was followed by 2 splendid days. Fine weather with sun, a good fair wind, and the swell astern. The big swell which so often prevails in these latitudes is a most inspiring sight, and must be seen from a comparatively small ship like the Terra Nova, for its magnitude to be truly appreciated. As the ship rose on the crest of one great hill of water, the next big ridge was nearly a mile away, with a sloping valley between. At times these seas are rounded in giant slopes as smooth as glass. At others they curl over, leaving a milk-white foam, and their slopes are marbled with a beautiful spumy tracery. Very wonderful are these mottled waves. With a following sea, at one moment it seems impossible that the great mountain which is overtaking the ship will not overwhelm her. At another it appears inevitable that the ship will fall into the space over which she seems to be suspended, and crash into the gulf which lies below. But the seas are so long that they are neither dangerous nor uncomfortable, though the Terra Nova rolled to an extraordinary extent, quite constantly over 50 degrees each way, and sometimes 55 degrees. The cooks, however, had a bad time trying to cook for some 50 hands in the little galley on the open deck. Poor Archer's efforts to make bread sometimes ended in the scuppers, and the occasional jangle of the ship's bell gave rise to the saying that a moderate roll rings the bell, and a big roll brings out the cook. Noon on Sunday, September 18th, found us in latitude 39 or 20 S, and longitude 66 or 9 E, after a very good run for the Terra Nova of 200 miles in the last 24 hours. This made us about 2 days' run from St. Paul, an uninhabited island formed by the remains of an old volcano, the crater of which, surrounded as it were by a horseshoe of land, forms an almost landlocked harbor. It was hoped to make a landing here for scientific work, but it is a difficult harbor to make. We ran another 200 miles on Monday, and on Tuesday all preparations were made for the landing, with suitable equipment, and we were not a little excited at the opportunity. At 4:30 a.m. the next morning, all hands were turned out to take in sail preparatory to rounding St. Paul, which was just visible. The weather was squally, but not bad. By 5 a.m., however, it was blowing a moderate gale, and by the time we had taken in all sail, we had to give up hopes of a landing. We were thoroughly sick of sails by the time we finally reefed the foresail and ran before the wind under this and lower topsails. We passed quite close to the island and could see into the crater, and the cliffs beyond which rose from it, covered with greenish grass. There were no trees, and of birds we only saw those which frequent these seas. We had hoped to find penguins and albatross nesting on the island at this time of the year, and this failure to land was most disappointing. The island is 860 feet high, and for its size, precipitous. It extends some 2 miles in length and 1 mile in breadth. The following day, all the afterguard were turned on to shift coal. It should be explained that up to this time the bunkers, which lay one on the port and the other on the starboard side of the furnaces, had been entirely filled as required by 2 or more officers who volunteered from day to day. We took on board 450 tons of Crown Patent fuel at Cardiff in June 1910. This coal is in the form of bricks and is most handy since it can be thrown by hand from the holds through the bunker doors in the boiler room bulkhead, which after a time was left higher than the sinking level of the coal. The coal to be landed was this patent fuel, and it was now decided to shift farther aft all the patent fuel which was left, and stack it against the boiler room bulkhead, the coal which was originally there having been fed to the furnaces. Thus the dust which was finding its way through the floorboards and choking the pumps could be swept up, and a good stow could be made preparatory to the final fit-out in New Zealand, while the coal which was to be taken on board at Littleton could be loaded through the main hatch. In the meantime, the gale which had sprung up 6 days before and prevented us landing had died down. After leaving St. Paul, we had let the fires out and run under sail alone, and the following 2 days we ran 119 and 141 miles respectively, being practically becalmed at times on the following day, and only running 66 miles. By Tuesday night, September 27th, we had finished the coaling, and we celebrated the occasion by a champagne dinner. At the same time, we raised steam. Scott was anxious to push on, and so indeed was everybody else. But the wind was not disposed to help us, and headed us a good deal during the next few days, and it was not until October 2nd that we were able to set all plain sail in the morning watch. This absence of westerly winds in a region in which they are usually too strong for comfort was explained by Pennell by a theory that we were traveling in an anticyclone, which itself was traveling in front of a cyclone behind us. We were probably moving under steam about the same pace as the disturbance, which would average some 150 miles a day. From this may be explained many of the reports of continual bad weather met by sailing ships and steamers in these latitudes. If we had been a sailing ship without auxiliary steam, the cyclone would have caught us up, and we should have been traveling with it, and consequently in continual bad weather. On the other hand, a steamer pure and simple would have steamed through good and bad alike, but we, with our auxiliary steam, only made much the same headway as the disturbance traveling in our wake, and so remained in the anticyclone. Physical observations were made on the outward voyage by Simpson and Wright into the atmospheric electricity over the ocean, one set of which consisted of an inquiry into the potential gradient, and observations were undertaken at Melbourne for the determination of the absolute value of the potential gradient over the sea. Numerous observations were also made on the radium content of the atmosphere over the ocean, to be compared afterwards with observations in the Antarctic air. The variations in radium content were not large. Results were also obtained on the voyage of the Terra Nova to New Zealand, upon the subject of natural ionization in closed vessels. In addition to the work of the ship and the physical work above mentioned, work in vertebrate zoology, marine biology, and magnetism, together with 4 hourly observations of the salinity and temperature of the sea, was carried out during the whole voyage. In vertebrate zoology, Wilson kept an accurate record of birds, and he and Lilly another record of whales and dolphins. All the birds which could be caught, both at sea and on South Trinidad Island, were skinned and made up into museum specimens. They were also examined for external and internal parasites by Wilson, Atkinson, and myself, as were also such fish and other animals as could be caught, including flying fish, a shark, and last but not least, whales in New Zealand. The method of catching these birds may be worth describing. A bent nail was tied to a line, the other end of which was made fast to the halyards over the stern. sufficient length of line was allowed, either to cause the nail to just trail in the sea in the wake of the ship, or for the line to just clear the sea. Thus, when the halyard was hoisted to some 30 or 40 feet above the deck, the line would be covering a considerable distance of sea. The birds flying round the ship congregate for the main part in the wake, for here they find the scraps thrown overboard on which they feed. I have seen 6 albatross all together trying to eat up an empty treacle tin. As they fly to and fro, their wings are liable to touch the line which is spread out over the sea. Sometimes they will hit the line with the tips of their wings, and then there is no resulting capture, but sooner or later a bird will touch the line with the part of the wing above the elbow joint, humerus. It seems that on feeling the contact, the bird suddenly wheels in the air, thereby causing a loop in the line which tightens round the bone. At any rate, the next thing that happens is that the bird is struggling on the line and may be hauled on board. The difficulty is to get a line which is light enough to fly in the air, but yet strong enough to hold the large birds, such as albatross, without breaking. We tried fishing line with no success, but eventually managed to buy some 5-ply extra strong cobbler's thread, which is excellent for the purpose. But we wanted not only specimens, but also observations of the species, the numbers which appeared, and their habits, for little is known as yet of these seabirds. And so we enlisted the help of all who were interested, and it may be said that all the officers and many of the seamen had a hand in producing the log of seabirds, to which additions were made almost hourly throughout the daylight hours. Most officers and men knew the more common seabirds in the open ocean, and certainly of those in the pack and fringes of the Antarctic continent, which, with rare exceptions, is the southern limit of bird life. A number of observations of whales, illustrated by Wilson, were made, but the results so far as the seas from England to the Cape and New Zealand are concerned are not of great importance, partly because close views were seldom obtained, and partly because the whales inhabiting these seas are fairly well known. On October 3, 1910, in latitude 40°17' S and longitude 111 or 18 E, 2 adults of Balænoptera borealis, northern rorqual, were following the ship close under the counter, length 50 feet, with a light-colored calf some 18-20 feet long swimming with them. It was established by this and by a later observation in New Zealand, when Lilly helped to cut up a similar whale at the Norwegian whaling station at the Bay of Islands, that this rorqual, which frequents the sub-Antarctic seas, is identical with our northern rorqual. But this was the only close observation of any whales obtained before we left New Zealand. General information with regard to such animals is useful, however, as showing the relative abundance of plankton on which the whales feed in the ocean. There are, for instance, more whales in the Antarctic than in warmer seas, and some whales at any rate, e.g. humpback whales, probably come north into warmer waters in the winter, rather for breeding purposes than to get food. With regard to dolphins, 4 species were observed beyond question. The rarest dolphin seen was Tercio peroni, the peculiarity of which is that it has no dorsal fin. This was seen on October 20th, 1910, in latitude 40°51' S and longitude 153°56' E. Reports of whales and dolphins which are not based upon carcasses and skeletons must be accepted with caution. It is most difficult to place species with scientific accuracy, which can only be observed swimming in the water, and of which more often than not, only blows and the dorsal fins can be observed. The nomenclature of dolphins especially leaves much to be desired, and it is to be hoped that some expedition in the future will carry a Norwegian harpooner who could do other work as well, since they are very good sailors. Wilson was strongly of this opinion, and tried hard to get a harpooner, but they are expensive people so long as the present boom in whaling lasts, and perhaps it was on the score of expense that the idea was regretfully abandoned. We carried whaling gear formerly taken on the Discovery expedition and kindly lent for this expedition by the Royal Geographical Society of London. A few shots were tried, but an unskilled harpooner stands very little chance. If you go whaling, you must have had experience. The ship was not slowed down to enable marine biological observations to be taken on this part of the expedition, but something like 40 samples of plankton were taken with a full-speed net. We were unable to trawl on the bottom until we reached Melbourne, when a trawl was made in Port Phillip Harbour to try the gear and accustom men to its use. It was not a purpose of the expedition to spend time in deep-sea work until it reached Antarctic seas. For 4 days, the wind, such as there was of it, was dead ahead. It is not very often in the 40s that a ship cannot make progress for want of wind. But having set all plain sail on October 2nd, with a falling glass, we got a certain amount of wind on the port beam and did 158 miles in the next 24 hours. Sunday being quiet, Scott read service, while the officers and men grouped round the wheel. We seldom had service on deck, for Sundays became proverbial days for a blow on the way out, and service, if held at all, was generally in the wardroom. On one famous occasion we tried to play the pianola to accompany the hymns, but since the rolls were scored rather for musical effect than for church services, the pianola was suddenly found to be playing something quite different from what was being sung. All through the expedition, the want of someone who could play the piano was felt, and such a man is certainly a great asset in a life so far removed from all the pleasures of civilization. As Scott wrote in The Voyage of the Discovery, where one of the officers used to play each evening, "This hour of music has become an institution which none of us would willingly forego. I don't know what thoughts it brings to others, though I can readily guess, but of such things one does not care to write. I can well believe, however, that our music smooths over many a ruffle and brings us to dinner each night in that excellent humor, where all seem good-tempered, though cleared for action and ready for fresh argument." The wind freshened to our joy. Scott was impatient. There was much to be done, and the time for doing it was not too long, for it had been decided to leave New Zealand at an earlier date than had been attempted by any previous expedition, in order to penetrate the pack sooner and make an early start on the depot journey. The faintest glow of the aurora australis, which was to become so familiar to us, was seen at this time, but what aroused still more interest was the capture of several albatross on the lines flowing out over the stern. The first was a sooty, cornicoides. We put him down on the deck, where he strutted about in the proudest way, his feet going flop, flop, flop as he walked. He was a most beautiful bird, sooty black body, a great black head with a line of white over each eye, and a gorgeous violet line running along his black beak. He treated us with the greatest contempt, which from such a beautiful creature we had every appearance of deserving. Another day a little later we caught a wandering albatross, a black-browed albatross, and a sooty albatross all together, and set them on the deck tethered to the ventilators while their photographs were taken. They were such beautiful birds that we were loath to kill them, but their value as scientific specimens outweighed the wish to set them free, and we gave them ether so that they did not suffer. The Southern Ocean is the home of these and many species of birds, but among them the albatross is preeminent. It has been mentioned that Wilson believed that the albatross, at any rate, fly round and round the world over these stormy seas before the westerly winds, landing but once a year on such islands as Kerguelen, St. Paul, the Auckland Islands, and others to breed. If so, The rest that they can obtain upon the big breaking rollers which prevail in these latitudes must be unsatisfactory, judged by the standard of more civilized birds. I have watched seabirds elsewhere, of which the same individuals appeared to follow the ship day after day for many thousands of miles. But on this voyage, I came to the conclusion that a different set of birds appeared each morning, and that they were hungry when they arrived. Certainly they flew astern and nearer to the ship in the morning, feeding on the scraps thrown overboard. As the day went on and the birds' hunger was satisfied, they scattered, and such of them as continued to fly astern of the ship were a long way off. Hence we caught the birds in the early morning, and only one bird was caught after midday. The wind continued favorable and was soon blowing quite hard. On Friday, October 7th, we were doing 7.8 knots under sail alone, which was very good for the old Tarapush, as she was familiarly called, and we were then just 1,000 miles from Melbourne. By Saturday night, we were standing by top-gallant halyards. Campbell took over the watch at 4 a.m. on Sunday morning. It was blowing hard and squally, but the ship still carried top-gallants. There was a big following sea. At 6:30 a.m., there occurred one of those incidents of sea life which are interesting, though not important. Quite suddenly, the first really big squall we had experienced on the voyage struck us. Top-gallant halyards were let go, and the fore-top-gallant yard came down, but the main top-gallant yard jammed when only half down. It transpired afterwards that a gasket which had been blown over the yard had fouled the block of the sheet of the main upper topsail. The top-gallant yard was all tilted to starboard and swaying from side to side. The sail seemed as though it might blow out at any moment, and was making a noise like big guns, and the mast was shaking badly. It was expected that the top-gallant mast would go, but nothing could be done while the full fury of the wind lasted. Campbell paced quietly up and down the bridge with a smile on his face. The watch was grouped round the ratlines ready to go aloft, and Crean volunteered to go up alone and try and free the yard, but permission was refused. It was touch and go with the mast, and there was nothing to be done. The squall passed, the sail was freed and furled, and the next big squall found us ready to lower upper topsails, and all was well. Finally, the damage was a split sail and a strained mast. The next morning, a new top-gallant sail was bent, but quite the biggest hailstorm I have ever seen came on in the middle of the operation. Much of the hail must have been inches in circumference, and hurt even through thick clothes and oilskins. At the same time, there were several waterspouts formed. The men on the top-gallant yard had a beastly time. Below on deck, men made hail balls and pretended they were snow. From now onwards, we ran on our course before a gale. By the early morning of October 12th, Cape Otway Light was in sight. Working double tides in the engine room, and with every stitch of sail set, we just failed to reach Port Phillip Heads by midday, when the tide turned, and it was impossible to get through. We went up Melbourne Harbor that evening, very dark and blowing hard. A telegram was waiting for Scott. Madeira, am going south, Amundsen. This telegram was dramatically important, as will appear when we come to the last act of the tragedy. Captain Roald Amundsen was one of the most notable of living explorers, and was in the prime of life, 41, 2 years younger than Scott. He had been in the Antarctic before Scott, with the Belgica expedition in 1897-99, and therefore did not consider the South Pole in any sense our property. Since then he had realized the dream of centuries of exploration by passing through the Northwest Passage, and actually doing so in a 60-ton schooner in 1905. The last we had heard of him was that he had equipped Nansen's old ship, the Fram, for further exploration in the Arctic. This was only a feint. Once at sea, he had told his men that he was going south instead of north. and when he reached Madeira, he sent this brief telegram, which meant, "I shall be at the South Pole before you." It also meant, though we did not appreciate it at the time, that we were up against a very big man. The admiral commanding the Australian station came on board. The event of the inspection was Nicker, the black ship's cat, distinguished by a white whisker on the port side of his face, who made one adventurous voyage to the Antarctic and came to an untimely end during the second. The seamen made a hammock for him with blanket and pillow and slung it forward among their own bedding. Nicker had turned in, not feeling very well, owing to the number of moths he had eaten, the ship being full of them. When awakened by the admiral, Nicker had no idea of the importance of the occasion, but stretched himself, yawned in the most natural manner, turned over, and went to sleep again. This cat became a well-known and much photographed member of the crew of the Terra Nova. He is said to have imitated the Romans of old, being a greedy beast, by having eaten as much seal blubber as he could hold, made himself sick, and gone back and resumed his meal. He had most beautiful fur. When the ship was returning from the Antarctic in 1911, Nicker was frightened by something on deck and jumped into the sea, which was running fairly rough. However, the ship was hove to, a boat lowered, and Nicker was rescued. He spent another happy year on board, but disappeared one dark night when the ship was returning from her second journey to the south in 1912 during a big gale. He often went aloft with the men, of his own accord. This night he was seen on the main lower topsail yard, higher than which he never would go. He disappeared in a big squall, probably because the yard was covered with ice. Wilson rejoined the ship at Melbourne, and Scott left her to arrange further business matters and to rejoin in New Zealand. When he landed, I think he had seen enough of the personnel of the expedition to be able to pass a fair judgment upon them. I cannot but think that he was pleased. Such enthusiasm and comradeship as prevailed on board could bear only good fruit. It would certainly have been possible to find a body of men who could work a sailing ship with greater skill, but not men who were more willing, and that in the midst of considerable discomfort, to work hard at distasteful jobs and be always cheerful. And it must have been clear that with all the energy which was being freely expended, the expedition came first, and the individual nowhere. It is to the honor of all concerned that from the time it left London to the time it returned to New Zealand after 3 years, this spirit always prevailed. Among the executive officers, Scott was putting more and more trust in Campbell, who was to lead the northern party. He was showing those characteristics which enabled him to bring his small party safely through one of the hardest winters that men have ever survived. Bowers also had shown seaman-like qualities, which are an excellent test by which to judge the Antarctic traveler. A good seaman in sail will probably make a useful sledger, but at this time, Scott can hardly have foreseen that Bowers was to prove the hardest traveler that ever undertook a polar journey, as well as one of the most undaunted. But he had already proved himself a first-rate sailor. Among the junior scientific staff, too, several were showing qualities as seamen, which were a good sign for the future. Altogether, I think it must have been with a cheerful mind that Scott landed in Australia. When we left Melbourne for New Zealand, we were all a bit stale, which was not altogether surprising, and a run ashore was to do us a world of good after 5 months of solid grind, crowded up in a ship which thought nothing of rolling 50 degrees each way. Also, though everything had been done that could be done to provide them, the want of fresh meat and vegetables was being felt, and it was an excellent thing that a body of men, for whom every precaution against scurvy that modern science could suggest was being taken, should have a good course of anti-scorbutic food and an equally beneficial change of life before leaving civilization. And so it was with some anticipation that on Monday morning, October 24th, We could smell the land, New Zealand, that home of so many Antarctic expeditions, where we knew that we should be welcomed. Scott's Discovery, Shackleton's Nimrod, and now again Scott's Terra Nova have all in turn been berthed at the same quay in Littleton, for aught I know at the same number 5 shed, into which they have spilled out their holds, and from which they have been restowed with the addition of all that New Zealand, scorning payment, could give. And from there they have sailed, and thither their relief ships have returned year after year. Scott's words of the Discovery apply just as much to the Terra Nova. Not only did New Zealand do all in her power to help the expedition in an official capacity, but the New Zealanders welcomed both officers and men with open arms, and gave them to understand that although already separated by many thousands of miles from their native land, here in this new land they would find a second home, and those who would equally think of them in their absence and welcome them on their return. But we had to sail round the southern coast of New Zealand and northwards up the eastern coast before we could arrive at our last port of call. The wind went ahead, and it was not until the morning of October 28th that we sailed through Littleton Heads. The word had gone forth that we should sail away on November 27th, and there was much to be done in the brief month that lay ahead. There followed 4 weeks of strenuous work, into which was sandwiched a considerable amount of play. The ship was unloaded, when, as usual, men and officers acted alike as stevedores, and she was docked, that an examination for the source of the leak might be made by Mr. H. J. Miller of Littleton, who has performed a like service for more than one Antarctic ship. But the different layers of sheathing protecting a ship which is destined to fight against ice are so complicated that it is a very difficult matter to find the origin of a leak. All that can be said with any certainty is that the point where the water appears inside the skin of the ship is almost certainly not the locality in which it has penetrated the outside sheathing. Our good friend Miller, wrote Scott, attacked the leak and traced it to the stern. We found the false stern split, and in one case a hole bored for a long stern through bolt, which was much too large for the bolt. The ship still leaks, but the water can now be kept under with the hand pump by 2 daily efforts of 1/4 of an hour to 20 minutes. This in Littleton, but in a not far distant future every pump was choked, and we were bailing with 3 buckets, literally for our lives. Hours' feet of sorting and restowing not only the stores we had, but the cheese, butter, tinned foods, bacon, hams, and numerous other products which are grown in New Zealand, and which any expedition leaving that country should always buy there in preference to carrying them through the tropics, was a masterstroke of clear-headedness and organization. These stores were all relisted before stowing, and the green-banded or northern party and red-banded or main party stores were not only easily distinguishable, but also stowed in such a way that they were forthcoming without difficulty at the right time and in their due order. The 2 huts which were to form the homes of our 2 parties down south had been brought out in the ship and were now erected on a piece of waste ground, near, by the same men who would be given the work to do in the south. The gear peculiar to the various kinds of scientific work which it was the object of the expedition to carry out was also stowed with great care. The more bulky objects included a petrol engine and small dynamo, a very delicate instrument for making pendulum observations to test the gravity of the earth, meteorological screens, and a Dines anemometer. There was also a special hut for magnetic observations, of which only the framework was finely taken, with the necessary but bulky magnetic instruments. The biological and photographic gear was also of considerable size. For the interior of the huts there were beds with spring mattresses, a real luxury but one well worth the space and money. Tables, chairs, cooking ranges and piping, and a complete acetylene gas plant for both parties. There were also extensive ventilators, which were not a great success. The problem of ventilation in polar regions still remains to be solved. Food can be packed into a comparatively small space, but not so fuel, and this is one of the greatest difficulties which confront the polar traveler. It must be conceded that in this respect, Norway, with her wonderful petrol-driven Fram, is far ahead of us. The Terra Nova depended on coal, and the length of the ship's stay in the south, and the amount of exploration she could do after landing the shore parties, depended almost entirely upon how much coal she could be persuaded to hold after all the necessaries of modern scientific exploration had been wedged tightly into her. The Terra Nova sailed from New Zealand with 425 tons of coal in her holds and bunkers, and 30 tons on deck in sacks. We were to hear more of those sacks. Meanwhile, stalls were being built under the forecastle for 15 ponies, and, since room could not be found below for the remaining 4, stalls were built on the port side of the forehatch. The decks were caulked, and deck houses and other fittings which might carry away in the stormy seas of the south were further secured. As the time of departure drew near, and each day of civilization appeared to be more and more desirable, the scene in Littleton became animated and congested. Here is a scientist trying to force just one more case into his small laboratory, or decanting a mass of clothing just issued into the bottom of his bunk to be slept on, since there was no room for it on the deck of his cabin. On the main deck, Bowers is trying to get one more frozen sheep into the ice house. In the rigging, working parties are overhauling the running gear. The engine room staff are busy on the engine, and though the ship is crowded, there is order everywhere, and it is clean. But the scene on the morning of Saturday, November 26th, baffles description. There is no deck visible. In addition to 30 tons of coal in sacks on deck, there are 2 tons of petrol, stowed in drums which in turn are cased in wood. On the top of sacks and cases, and on the roof of the ice house, are 33 dogs, chained far enough apart to keep them from following their first instinct, to fight the nearest animal they can see. The ship is a hubbub of howls. In the forecastle and in the 4 stalls on deck are the 19 ponies, wedged tightly in their wooden stalls, and dwarfing everything are the 3 motor sledges in their huge crates, 16 X5 X4, 2 of them on either side of the main hatch, the third across the break of the poop. They are covered with tarpaulins and secured in every possible way, but it is clear that in a big sea their weight will throw a great strain upon the deck. It is not altogether a cheerful sight, but all that care and skill can do has been done to ensure that the deck cargo will not shift, and that the animals may be as sheltered as possible from wind and seas. And it's no good worrying about what can't be helped.